You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Continuing support for Rootbound is brought to you by Roses. Baby, I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the gray. Ooh, the more I get of you, the stranger it feels. Yeah. This is a weird ad. Roses.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Rootbound. My name is Steve. I'm just sitting out here in my garden, and I'm picking some dandelion leaves. Dandelions are really tasty green, I talked about in the second episode of the podcast. And, on this episode, we're going to be talking more about foraging. This is maybe not quite foraging because it's in my garden, but it is a wild plant. And so as we discuss foraging, I wanted to kind of talk about a few kind of guidelines and ethics for foraging. I'm a new forager myself. I'm still trying to learn all this stuff, and I thought I might share some of the advice I've gotten. And so first off, just a disclaimer, Rootbound is not responsible for anything that you do in the wilderness, anything that you eat, anything that you harvest. Be smart, make good choices, be responsible. Don't take any of this as a recommendation. This is just general information that you can use however you will. Second, before you decide to start harvesting any wild plant, you should always consult with a local expert. Talking with someone who really knows the plants in your area is really the best way to positively identify a plant, which is important for safety, and it's also the best way to understand how to responsibly harvest the plant in your area, because that changes from place to place. Similarly, before you decide to start harvesting any wild plant, you should do as much research as you can about those plants, really try to understand them as best as possible, and try to observe those plants in the wild for a bit before you decide to start harvesting them. And finally, and maybe most importantly, before you decide to start harvesting any wild plant, make sure you know how to harvest responsibly and never take more than you need. You'll read online about this thing called the rule of thirds, which is to, at maximum, only ever take 1/3 of any wild resource out there. I tend to skew even more conservative than that and take even less than that. Think about what you need and think about how what you take might damage the environment. And also think about people who might come behind you. You might only take 1/3, but if someone else comes and takes 1/3 and someone else comes and takes 1/3, that could be damaging. So you got to think about how you're going to have an impact on the wild environment and how you're going to have an impact on that wild environment and err on the side of caution. But yeah, those are some rules and guidelines about foraging. If I missed anything, audience, I am a beginner myself. If you think I missed something or you think there's something really important that I should have covered, feel free to email me, rootboundpodcast@gmail.com. And with that, let's move on to our guest segment for today.
I just took a foraging class, and not to brag, I was voted Mr. Fungus.
Hi, Mallory. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Steve.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. Common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca.
That's great. Milkweed, I think we all know about milkweed because of monarch butterflies, but that's I think all we get as children. And then I've just now understood its edibility a little bit, but I've not really experimented. So I'm super excited for you to share that because I think sometimes we just need permission from someone who knows more to actually try stuff. And I see the milkweed and I'm so yeah, anyway, I'm very excited to hear about milkweed from you, Mallory.
Great. The thing that drew me to milkweed, and I think the thing that I learned from milkweed, which is something I try to, when I have a plant that's really special to me, it's usually there's a lesson that I learned from it, a specific thing that it taught me about either food or about ecology or about the life cycle of plants or the life cycles of animals and birds and butterflies. Obviously, in this case, butterflies are important. But the thing I learned from milkweed, I think, is a certain kind of patience with learning a plant. When I first read about milkweed, the wild food literature is full of stern warnings about milkweed and its toxicity. and especially its bitterness. And these are very common misconceptions that are repeated ad nauseum in the literature. The other way I learned patience was because I know it's such a precious plant for not just monarchs, but many other pollinators. One of the things I love about milkweed is in the height of the season when the flowers are blooming, the plant is absolutely covered with different insects. Usually I'll see, very commonly, I guess I would say, I'll see 10, 12 different insects on a milkweed plant. Uh, and actually, they're not pollinated by monarchs, they're pollinated by large wasps and bees.
Oh, wow. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
the monarchs are not effective pollinators. They do use it as their food source for the caterpillars, but they do not. They can't really effectively pollinate. It has to do with the complexity of the milkweed flower. Also, if you see hummingbirds on a milkweed plant, they can't get into it. They're trying, but they can't get the nectar.
Oh, very interesting. Um, that's really interesting. I want to get back to that patience lesson a little bit because I think
Yeah,
that's super fascinating. But just maybe
well,
for
you
a
have
little
to.
bit of just background. Wait, say that
I
again.
said, well, you have to be patient about the patience lesson.
Oh, true, true. Uh, very, very good. I did want to maybe go back just a little bit to basics for some people who might be
Sure.
listening who've never seen milkweed before and what it looks like and maybe some of its descriptions.
Well, it's very tall. It's probably. I've always read that it caps out at 6 feet, but I don't know that I've ever seen a 6 foot tall milkweed plant. I think about 5 feet is pretty normal, 4 to 5 feet in my area anyway. They may get taller elsewhere. Um, they grow pretty much anywhere, roadsides, open meadows. They can tolerate dry and sandy soil. They spread very, very quickly and very erratically. They don't form dense clusters. They form little communities because they spread primarily by rhizomes. So they'll sneak around and kind of pop up, here and there in a field, but they can become quite numerous. That was the patience that I learned was I was loath to collect it because I was worried that I was going to do damage to the population. And so I spent a couple of years really studying the local population to see how much of it there was. And when I realized there was quite an abundance of it, I felt safer in collecting it. And I think that's a really good rule of thumb with any native plant, is to observe it very carefully like that. It's why I don't collect ramps, for instance. There are just not enough of them in the area. The leaves are kind of downy, covered with a little bit of a soft down. Um, they're large leaves, pretty simple, with a big midrib. The flowers are very colorful. They range from kind of a greenish tinted pink to an almost purple, lilac purple color. Sometimes they have a lot of white in them. They have kind of a range of color. There's also a number of milkweeds, but the common milkweed is the one that you'll see the most often, and it's quite. The other ones are quite distinctive looking from it. They don't look very similar, except in the structure of the flower, which is like a globe with these very complex multiple flowers in it. And the colors are often similar, although a butterfly weed, for instance, is bright orange. That's another native to the area. Most of the milkweeds are native to North America, or Central or South America. There are some native to Africa as well, which is where the plant was named. And the Syriaca in the common name is because Linnaeus thought that the plant came from the Middle East, um, even though it's native to North America. So it's just one of those incorrect uh, binomial names that stuck.
That seems to be a theme. It happens a lot.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think I know about milkweed is the flowers are kind of going right now where I am, but then there's the pods, and what do those look like, and how do those pods form from the flowers? Actually, something I've never been
They
clear of.
they start out real small. They're kind of they look a bit like well, they're often compared to okra, but that's more about how they're cooked. They're sort of fat little football shapes with a bit of a beak, a bit of an extended kind of nose to them. The way they develop is they start out real small with immature silk material inside them, which you can also eat when it's young. It's like almost like a cheese. You open it, you
Mm.
can scrape the material out and throw it into a pasta, and people will actually think it's just melted cheese because it has the same kind
Oh, wow.
of look to it. Yeah, it's very interesting. That's the sort of the quote unquote fifth edible part. I always call it that there's five edible parts, and that's the fifth one.
Mm.
The the other ones are the shoots, the buds, the flowers, and the pods, the whole pods. But you can only eat the pods before the material inside is formed. General rule of thumb is about 2 inches is about the size you want, and not when they're super small. You want them to get a little bit big, 1.5 to 2 inches, somewhere in that range. And before the material forms, when the material forms inside the outside of the pod gets very woody and
Hmm.
or well, very densely fibrous, and the inside becomes inedible because it's essentially turning into a kind of silk. That's the material that's used most often now in milkweed when it's used as a non-edible material. Like you can stuff pillows with it. Uh,
Mm.
During World War II, they uh, children gathered milkweed to stuff into life preservers because the life preserver was usually filled with kapok material from the kapok tree, which is in Indonesia, which was controlled by Japan. So they
Wow.
weed fluff and used those to stuff the life preservers with. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Wow, that's super. Wow, that's really fascinating. And that silk inside is its purpose to like send the seeds in the air? Is that what it's for? Or
Yeah, they're like it becomes if you ever go in a big milkweed field in autumn, you'll see with the pods split open and it sort of rides the wind. They spread. They mostly actually spread by rhizomes, but they also spread
hmm.
fairly effectively by seed. That's usually how they establish newer colonies, and it's why it can be such a widespread weed. The reason it's not as widespread as it used to be has more to do with agriculture than anything else, and people also seeing it as a noxious plant or an obnoxious plant. Uh, People think it's ugly, which I find really strange because it's one of the
Hmm.
plants. And the flower is so incredibly beautiful and attract. I guess also people don't like plants that attract bees, which it certainly does. It attracts all kinds of insects. So it even has two specific bugs that feed on it. There's a small and a large milkweed bug. That they two different species that feed on it fairly exclusively.
Um, Very interesting. I'm thinking now about what you said about seeing a field in fall, and I think I've seen that with the silk. But what do the seeds look like? Are they really tiny? Or I
No,
can't imagine
they're
the seed.
large. They
Mm.
look like little eyes. They have kind of they're oval and they have a like a dot in the middle of them. There's a casing around it. It's just a hard seed with a casing. They look like eyes, and then they catch on the wind with those strands of silk. So and there's usually
Very,
a huge number of them per pod. There's quite a few in each pod. So that's part of their
uh,
strategy. It's also a perennial plant, and even will be perennial within this or return within the space of a season. If you cut milkweed shoots, the shoot will return.
oh
Yeah,
wow.
one of the fields that I visit a lot that has milkweed in it is regularly. There's a trail mowed through it, and you'll always see when you walk through, the grass will be kind of low, but then there'll be the milkweed that they mowed over popping up like a little bit higher than the grass. And the plants will never get as high as they would
Hmm.
normally, but they'll still flower. Even though they're really short, they could be like a foot or two tall and they'll still flower.
Very interesting. So I thought maybe I have a couple of things I want to go into this because it's super fascinating. One, if we've had the patience to get back to the patience part, and I think you were talking about this common knowledge of its toxicity, which is something you hear about a lot of plants, and I just would love to hear you talk about that a little bit more, and how you came to how you know went beyond the common knowledge, or your story with that, because that's really interesting. And then maybe after that we can talk about how one would eat them.
Great. Yeah. So there's a real common thread in the literature, which is that it's toxic. Now, a lot of milkweeds are toxic, but common milkweed isn't toxic to humans. It shouldn't be eaten raw, although you can eat it raw. Many people will, well, not many people, but some people might get an upset stomach from eating it raw. But it's not particularly high in the toxic compounds that are found in other milkweed species. It's quite low in them, and the the real common misconception about it is that it's bitter. It's not bitter at all. In fact, one of the ways you can differentiate between milkweed and dogbane, which dogbane doesn't look anything like milkweed once it's fully grown, or even partially grown. But the shoots, people confuse the shoots for each other, even though they are fairly different. But they're not. They're different to people that really understand plants. They're not different for people that are learning. So it's one to avoid. But if you cut a piece of milkweed shoot, even the sap itself isn't bitter to the taste, whereas that of dogbane, if you cut a piece of dogbane, which is a toxic plant, and taste the sap, the sap is incredibly, incredibly bitter. The I'm not really sure why there's this misconception about bitterness. Sam Thayer seems to think that it all stems from Yule Gibbons, and that Yule Gibbons was preparing dogbane rather than milkweed because he instructs everyone to boil it 3 times to, that it's extremely bitter unless it's processed and you can't use cold water. You have to pour boiling water over it, because if you use cold water, it'll fix the bitterness principle in it. There's all this stuff in the literature, and then a lot of people just copied that information from Gibbons. I'm not sure that that's 100% correct, because my basic thought on that is I've got a couple different editions of Stalking the Wild Asparagus, which is Gibbons' classic book, and there's a pretty clear picture of milkweed on the milkweed page. I find it hard to believe that he never once opened a copy of his own book, looked at that, and said, "That's not the plant I'm eating. Wait a minute." And that kind of strained my credulity a little bit. I think maybe he just believed it was bitter and didn't really taste it, because I have found some classical sources from white settlers and colonists writing down what Native Americans did with the plant and saying that it was processed multiple times, that it was bitter. So that may have been where he got that information, and he just never tried. Which is, kind of understandable. If you believe a plant's toxic and it has to be processed, you're not going to sit there and start munching on it raw, unless you're, slightly crazy, which I guess is what happened to me. I sort of just, I never really, to be honest, as I read about it more and more and I encountered it more and more, I kind of, I started with the first thing I think I did was I cooked some of the buds in a stir fry. And I didn't bother boiling them multiple times because it didn't make a lot of sense to me from what I was reading. And at that point, I'd read a couple things online where people said, who were experienced, said, I don't really process this that much. I fry the pods and things like that. It's a similar thing with pokeweed. If you read about pokeweed, there's all this cautionary tales about processing pokeweed, which you definitely need to do, but traditionally in Appalachia, they just took the stalks and peeled them and then battered them and fried them. These people didn't die, so there's some leeway to the toxicity of it. But the toxic compounds that are found in milkweeds are they're found in much, much higher concentrations and toxic concentrations in things like Asclepias tuberosa, which is a butterfly weed, Asclepias incarnata, which is swamp milkweed. I don't advise eating any of those. Common milkweed is the only one to eat. And especially because unless you're growing them, which I will get to, because that's where I eat most of my milkweed, is just from my own yard. Unless you're growing them, those other milkweeds are fairly uncommon, at least in my area. They're not all over the woods like common milkweed is, and common milkweed is everywhere.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, let's talk about, you said there's 5 different ways to eat it. I wonder if you could quickly go through
Yeah,
those, I mean, 5 parts,
5 parts.
and how you would eat them. Yeah, how you would eat each of those parts. I mentioned it a little bit before, but maybe we didn't catch it. So
Yeah,
yeah, maybe you could talk about how those 5 and how you prefer to cook them.
sure. So the first part is the shoot. And it's like asparagus. It's the same kind of thing. You bend it and snap it where it breaks, or you can cut it if you want. And it's a shoot with the leaves furled together, held together against the stem, um, kind of like pokeweed. Similar sort
Hmm.
of thing. That's the stage you collect it at. Usually when it's 6 to 8 inches tall, something like that. And if you cut this early enough in the season, it will come back. Actually, it doesn't even have to be that early. Milkweed's a very pernicious plant. It just keeps coming back. And, all the ones that I've never lost a milkweed plant, they just keep spreading in all the little spots where I've planted them, and then they just spread willy nilly all over the yard. The shoot it's a bit like asparagus. I don't tend to eat a lot of shoots because I kind of prefer the bounty of all the other edible parts. But I usually cut a few if I know I'm coming back to an area. And again, in those mode spots, I'll cut them. Like when I see the mode trail and I see the new shoots come up, I'll go, I'll go through real quick and cut those. I like them. The shoot is really good, just steamed, uh, or pan fried. Real quick. You only need to cook it for a very brief period of time. I don't. All the classical literature suggests to boil milkweed. I've never really boiled milkweed. I
Hmm.
only occasionally will blanch the pods, which we'll get to, but I don't boil the shoots. I tend to either just stir fry them or steam them. They're really nice steamed with just a little bit of butter, salt and pepper, something like that. Very simple. Then the buds are the part that's compared to broccoli a lot. Uh, they taste like most of the parts taste to me like green beans. It's actually they taste like milkweed, but green bean is probably the closest vegetable that I would compare the flavor to. There's a very kind of clean vegetal characteristic to it. It doesn't have the bitterness of broccoli or the weird, like, I don't even know what, grassiness of asparagus. It doesn't
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
those flavors. It's a very gentle, it's a pretty mild vegetable, but really flavorful. It has a slight sweetness too. I read something recently when I was reading up for the show. Someone compared eating raw milkweed to eating plums, which I thought was really.
Oh.
I wanna, yeah, I wanna like taste some a raw milkweed bud now with that in mind because that's a very interesting analogy. It does have a subtle sweetness to it. It's not super sweet, but it's got a subtle sweetness to it, kind of like green beans can. But so the buds I really like stir fried, and they also make great little fritters, or a little tempura. A good
Mm-hmm.
way to prepare them. They have a real. They I think really benefit from the like a very light amount of cooking. I think they have such a nice flavor that you don't want to overcook them, and they get soggy quickly, especially boiled. That's why I never boil them. I pickle them too, which is really,
Mm.
and I've lacto fermented them. Um,
Oh,
Quite
cool.
good. Yeah, they get a little funky lacto fermented, so you have to get them in the fridge kind of quick. Um, but nothing like lacto fermented hosta, for instance, which if you ferment that for more than 2 days, it smells like wet dog. Uh, but, um, and then when the buds open up, the flowers are edible, and people use them a lot to make simple syrup or cordials or liqueurs. They tend to turn whatever liquid they're immersed in. I make vinegar with them primarily. They tend to turn whatever liquid they're in a really lovely pink. Um,
Hmm.
and they also have a mild coagulant factor, which can be nice for a simple syrup. I mean, it helps. helps bring things together. They were used a lot in soups by Native Americans, which is interesting. I haven't really tried that, and apparently they can also be dried very well, which I've also not done. I haven't really. I've preserved them by freezing, and I've preserved them in, in liquids, but I haven't tried. But apparently they dry quite well, which makes sense because the flour is very sturdy. It's a very complex and sturdy flour. You can squeeze each individual flour, and they're quite firm. And yeah, but that's mostly, I think, that's the part of the milkweed that has the more sweet applications. It has a very, very sweet nature as a flower. It's not in any way bitter. I like to throw them in my summer rolls and things like that too. They're really nice. Just pull each individual little flower off each cluster has dozens of flowers on it. So, and then my favorite part is the pods, which I think my favorite way to make those is I blanch them very quickly in boiling water and then drain them, and then I bake them in the oven in a sauce. It's actually based on a traditional Greek dish, which is a green bean dish, and I bake them with like onions and tomatoes and tomato sauce and a lot of olive oil, and like you kind of cook everything together in a saute pan for a few minutes, and then you put it in the oven and cover it with foil or parchment paper, and it bakes into this, for a really long time, into this like really slow cooked stewed type dish, which then you can eat at room temperature or still warm. I actually prefer it like cooled down a bit and at room temperature. It's kind of like a nice little mezza type dish, but
Wow, that sounds great.
really good. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
I make every year. Yeah, and and I've done things too. I cook a lot of Indian inspired food, and I have a lot of good Indian preparations for okra, and I've used some of those too, which are kind of actually quite similar. The um, Indians use um, tomatoes a lot with okra because it cuts the mucilaginous factor. The acid tomatoes makes the okra less slimy. They'll do like whole okra fried and then cooked with onions and tomatoes, it's quite similar actually to the Greek dish, but with a lot of spices. And I've done stuff like that, and done, and of course, you can't really beat deep frying them like fried okra. That's really good too. And then the fifth part is the cheese inside the pods, or the immature silk, which you can just use like you would cheese, throw it in. It's actually great in like a cooked pasta dish. And there's a window, it's a pretty brief window, but where the pod becomes a little bit too firm to eat whole, but the immature silk inside is still good. But it's very difficult. One thing about that is you have to be kind of careful because it's very difficult to tell. Uh, you have to get the feel of it right. I wouldn't advise collecting like 24 pods off of plants and then coming home to find that they're all too firm. You have to kind of learn how the feel of it relates to what's going on inside, because it can be tough to tell at first. That's one thing about milkweed. I really don't encourage people to go absolutely hog wild on it, but to really, again, going back to the patience thing, to really understand their native population before they collect any. I waited a couple years before I collected any milkweed at all, and that was a very conscious decision on my part to not impact this population until I really had a good grasp on, exactly how much of it there was, where the really abundant areas were, and then of course I started growing it, which made things a little bit easier, and I've since had tons of monarch caterpillars and butterflies in my yard all the time, and lots of bees too.
Because of this close association, the monarch is sometimes called the milkweed butterfly. If you have not recognized the plant, perhaps you know it by its fluffy seeds.
Thanks for sharing milkweed with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Great. Well, this was a challenge for me because I know you're quite a plant person, and I thought maybe my my technique for maybe being able to surprise you is to move over to Europe, because you talk a lot about North American plants. And I did live in Switzerland for 5 years, and so I have some experience in Switzerland. However, when I lived there, I wasn't quite really into plants. I actually regret that now because I lived there and I know that Europe has really cool cultures of foraging and wild plants, but I didn't really understand it. However, if you live in Switzerland, you cannot avoid what is called the Bärlauch season, and that is my plant, which is Bärlauch. Are you familiar with Bärlauch?
No, not at all.
So you may know it by its English name because it's common all across Europe. So there's names for it in all the languages, but its name in England is Ramsons.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So it is the European cousin of the ramp, which you mentioned earlier, and I picked that because, and maybe I'll have you chime in a little bit of ramps, as you mentioned, you don't harvest and are kind of problematic over here. I don't know if you want to chime in about that just briefly with ramps, but yeah, because I know you have some interesting, strong feelings about ramps.
Yeah. So you're the Ramson is Allium ursinum, right?
Ursinum, yes, and the ramps are Allium tricolor.
Well, hence
or
bear.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the name in German means bear leek.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, Ali, and in lots of other languages it means bear. It's related to bears, and I'll get into a little bit. But I just maybe just to have you give your brief warning to the listeners as far as how you feel about ramps. You mentioned it a bit earlier, but to make that clear.
Well, I think that you bringing up the European tradition is very, very important for American foragers because in Europe the tradition is they almost never dig the root. It's all leaves. And
Right.
that is what we need to do here because, first of all, the leaf is where all the flavor is. The leaves are much more flavorful than the bulb end. I don't find the bulbs particularly interesting. I don't think they're any more interesting than the bulbs of scallions or field garlic. And I definitely don't think it's worth digging a plant that is a native plant that is in certain parts of its range. Of course it's still abundant because it does form very thick communities, but in my area it is not abundant. It is danger. We're in between two major cities, Philadelphia and New York, and basically roughly equidistant from both, and our woods are filled with invasive plants which tend to outcompete the ramps. In particular, garlic mustard and field garlic. Both are, they encroach into the population. Another plant that actually encroaches into the population of ramps here is mayapple, which is a native plant, but that also really dense stands and is very, very common here. And I've found several places where mayapple communities sort of overwhelm the ramps because they open pretty early too, and they keep the plants from photosynthesizing because they'll open up their big umbrellas on top of the ramps.
Right.
Yeah, so they also spread by rhizomatic growth, and they move fairly quickly. They don't reproduce much at all by seed. They very rarely reproduce by seed. But
yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, so yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting of this plant ramps, which is very popular, and you read about it everywhere, but it is because of its popularity at risk, and so I think your point of you don't harvest it where you see them where you are because there's not enough, and then also this I think problem of harvesting the whole plant, like you mentioned, and harvesting the bulb is something very common. Like if you go to the farmer's market, you never just see the leaves; it's always the bulbs, right? And as you said, in Europe, that is not the tradition. I never knew. I didn't really have much. Like I knew Bärlauch was in dishes and stuff like that, but you never saw a bulb. It's always the leaves.
Always the leaves.
And I think because of that reason, Bärlauch is really abundant in Europe. Like, I mean, you walk in the woods and you smell it in the right time of year. The menus in Switzerland is just like in the springtime, everybody has Bärlauch on the menu, and that definitely has to do, I think, the tradition of harvesting. Also, from my understanding, the plant is a little bit of a faster reproducer than ramps. Ramps is like a little bit slow, and it's not as fast as like field garlic, I don't think, but it's I think about twice as fast of reproductive.
Yeah, well, the ramps take a ramp takes 7 years to go from seed to flower.
And from what I read, it was a little bit unclear. I was trying to find some sources, but it's about 2 to 3 for the Bärlauch. So yeah, when I was in Switzerland, I would eat it. I loved the flavor. I'd smell it in the woods, but I actually never saw it growing, and I just wasn't curious enough about plants back then, which I regret now. But this spring, we went back to Switzerland to visit it for the first time in a long time, and I was just we were actually in Liechtenstein, and we parked the car to like go see the castle of Liechtenstein, and like right in front of the car, I was like, is that Bärlauch? I got so excited. Everyone I was with thought it was, but I was like so excited that I could recognize it, even though I'd never seen it really in person before, but I've been reading about ramps and knew it was similar. And so then I did the test, which is you break it and you smell it and it smells like garlic. And I was like, it is. And then that's when I also learned from my friend from Liechtenstein was like, there are, which I don't know if this is the case here, there are 2 plants in Europe that are similar looking, but have toxic properties. One being lily of the valley and one being, it's autumn crocus, which I guess you don't have the worry of like harvesting autumn crocus around the time Bärlauch is because they have different seasons, but they can look pretty similar. But Lily of the Valley also looks pretty similar and is around the same time frame as that. But it doesn't smell like garlic.
No, it doesn't smell like garlic. It does look fairly similar, and I have seen it in areas in the woods where you might expect to find ramps. Usually it's a place where there was a home site that's been abandoned. Because it is perennial and it forms real dense communities like ramps do, and it does look quite similar when it first emerges. So yeah, that's always the tell. There's actually a lot of plants that look similar to Allium canadense or Allium vineale, the field garlic, the Canada onion garlic. And the like you said, the tell is always the smell. It's, you break it, if it smells like garlic, it's garlic. If it smells like onions or garlic and it looks like onions or garlic, it's an alley.
It's a good trick, which I've had a little bit of experience in my yard with some of the field garlic as well. And there's some of those other plants that look almost as similar, but luckily that's a good trick. I wanted to just mention the life cycle of ramps, which I think is very interesting. Those leaves come out in the springtime, or ramsons we're talking about, not ramps, but they're the same. The life cycle is basically the same. The ramsons or the Bärlauch comes out in the early spring and have these, pretty big leaves for, I think, what we think of for, domestic garlics. The leaves are much bigger, and it's because they're this plant that's trying to gather up all the sun before the leaves of the trees leaf out, right? So it's gathering that light. And then the leaves die back, and they send up that really cool little flower, which is really nice. I think there was a mix of those flowers and the leaves when I saw the Bärlauch. So I don't know. Does ramps have leaves when it has the stalk, or not at all?
They're usually drooping at that point. And I've often seen the flower just alone. I think it's got a much slower cycle.
Yeah.
I've once or twice I've seen a flower up with the kind of the dripping post photosynthesis leaves, which is actually that's pretty much when I collect leaves. If I didn't collect any this year at all, but I do collect them. I just I snip them kind of like when they start to droop and after they've returned their energy to the bulb, and then
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I just dry them and mix them with salt and.
Oh, cool.
Ramps all year long. Or oil. Really good infused in olive oil, too.
We bought some Bärlauch salt while we were in Liechtenstein. It's like a thing they sell. It's like a big deal there. But unfortunately, it fell open and spilled all over our back. I was really bummed, so we didn't get to bring any back. So one interesting thing I found, and this actually ties into something you said earlier. There's 2 things I want to mention about the name Bärlauch. And the name Bärlauch means bear leek or bear garlic, and lots of other languages have the same name. But I found several references on the internet to the reason why it's called that is that they say that European brown bears like to eat them after coming out of hibernation. And this is one of those things, though, where the literature, if you Google it, you see this over and over again without any primary source. And so, I mean, I can believe it, but I also have not seen any I haven't seen any photos of bears eating Bärlauch. And I was wondering very much so if this is like something that's true or if it's just like, an old wives' tale. But it's funny if you Google it, you find the same answer over and over again without any actual evidence, which is interesting, and it very very well could be true. I did try to message a couple friends from Romania because that's like the place that has the most European brown bears in Europe still, and I was wondering if they had like any firsthand knowledge, but I have not heard back yet.
Yeah.
So if I get a good message back, I'll put that at the end of the
Yeah.
show. But
Great.
I'm not hopeful to have it for sure. But I would love to hear someone say, "Yeah, I see them eat those in the spring." But that's the commonest knowledge of why it's called Bärlauch is that. But it could also just be that it's wild garlic, and the other name for it, though, and this is a similar story. One of the other names that is called sometimes called cow leek, and there is a few references also on Wikipedia and over again, and they all say the same thing, but I can't find the real evidence. Is they say that dairy farmers, some in the UK and some in Switzerland, used to feed a lot of Bärlauch to their cows to make a slightly garlically flavored milk to make cheese. And I believe it, but I want to know what was that cheese called and where was it grown? And the internet is just like, they did this and there's no other details. I'm like, no, please tell me. So I did message a Swiss friend, and we'll see if he knows, but he probably doesn't.
One would think it would be easiest just to put the leaves in the cheese.
That's true, and they do that for sure. They do that for sure.
That's great.
But
the seasoning salt is the thing, though, because that's one of my favorite, seasoning salts is the ramp salt. It really has it really transmits that flavor, quite effectively without using a lot of material, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to see if I can get a friend to send me some. I was really bummed when we opened our suitcase and there's just like the bag smelled great though.
Yeah,
because it was filled with Bärlauch salt. But anyway, I did think that was an interesting thing. This is not related to plants, but you mentioned it too. Is just this thing how common knowledge can repeat. And I think in some ways Google is broken in that way, where you'll get the fact that everyone decides to repeat over and over again without ever getting to the core of what that means. And yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer when I'm researching plants. I'll find something, they're like, oh, that's interesting, but what is the real story beneath that? And I think it would be much more interesting. But I think the way Google works and the way the internet works and the way other kind of literature works, we tend to repeat things. And it's an interesting epistemological problem that I was thinking about when thinking about Bärlauch, but also other plants we're talking about as well.
Yeah, it's a common misinformation. I mean, it's true with, and milkweed's a plant that, and wild garlics and onions too are plants that both have these, a lot of times, very common misconceptions attached to them that people repeat without really sort of exploring the reasoning behind it. In going back to milkweed for a second, I mean, one of the things I've noticed about it is posting about, even though I was very, very careful about how I approached it, posting about it over the years, I've had people, rage at me that I would dare consume this plant. As if I was the one responsible for, the mass agricultural reshaping of the planet. That's I mean, that's why, we don't have, we have an issue with monarch butterflies. It's not because I'm eating a few milkweed buds in the spring. It's because we reshape the planet into a factory farm, and we eliminate plants like this from our homes and from our fields with equal abandon because, we don't see it as what it is. Luckily things are changing, but, and the same thing is true of ramps. I mean, they're an exploited resource. They're something that has gone from being like a niche food in Appalachia and, occasionally on restaurant tables, to something that now you can buy in Whole Foods, thrown into a giant bin with a bunch of other, cultivated plants.
Yeah.
That's just alarming because it's not the same thing, Luckily, though, they're actually kind of easy to grow. And I have allium or cinnamon seeds, which I want to plant.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm going to plant them in the fall, though, because they need to be cold stratified, like milkweed ramps. So they need the cold season to stratify the seed. Hey.
I've got my cat. He always demands, this is Cheeto, he always demands to be on camera when I'm talking to people, which is hilarious.
Frances hasn't shown up. She usually likes when I'm on a call. the problem is our system, not individual act.
Yeah.
And the more that people can learn that these foods can be very sustainable, cutting a ramp leaf late in the season is not going to harm the plant. It's already got a lot of energy for the next year. It's going to develop, and you can collect one here and there, and you can do something useful with them. Taking a couple buds off of a milkweed plant, which usually has 5 to 8 flowers on it, isn't going to detract from it being a lure for the monarch to come and lay its eggs on the leaves, which is what the caterpillars eat, the leaves really, primarily, and not the parts that we eat. They do sometimes eat parts of the pods, but they primarily eat the leaves, and it's we can coexist with this. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
A wiser fellow than myself once said, sometimes you eat the bar and much obliged. Sometimes the bar while he eats you.
That some kind of Eastern thing?
Far from it.
Well, that was super fascinating, talking with Mallory about milkweed and bärlauch, and also ramps. And actually, I think this episode is also going to be the ramps episode, because ramps is so similar to bärlauch. And also, we talked a lot about ramps, and also since ramps are so threatened in this area, I think having a particular ramps episode is probably not a good idea, because we wouldn't want to incentivize any more over-harvesting of them. So this is the milkweed, bärlauch, and also ramps episode of the podcast. On that note, I mentioned how I texted some friends in Romania about that story of bears coming out of hibernation and eating bärlauch. And if you remember on episode 9, my friend Raluca was on the show, and she's from Romania, and she said she used to gather bärlauch, or it's actually called leurdas, I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Romania. But she collected it every spring as a child in the forests of Romania. But she had never heard that myth about bears. So maybe it's not a common myth or story in Romania, or maybe it's just something she never heard. But she Googled it and found the same kind of apocryphal stories that I did. So unfortunately, that mystery is not solved. But if you have any evidence of bears eating bärlauch in the forest, please send me some information. That would be really cool. But as of now, it will remain a mystery if that's really true or just a story. Also, my friend in Switzerland had no idea about the cow thing. But yeah. Something that Mallory mentioned in this episode really stuck with me, and that was when he said that plants that are his favorites are the plants that tend to have lessons to teach him. And that really stuck with me, and I think it's true for the way that I choose the plants that I talk about on this podcast as well. I just never kind of put it together in those words. But yeah, I do think the plants I've talked about do have things to teach me. And so I think going forward on Rootbound, every episode, I'm going to try to answer that question. Like, what lesson does this plant have to teach me? And so I think this was a really great episode. I'm really thankful for having Mallory on, and really kind of gave me a new question to think about. And it's something we're going to do on every episode going forward. So thanks, Mallory. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Mallory O'Donnell. Mallory is a wild food gatherer, grower, cook, and writer focused on the ethical and sustainable use of native edible medicinal plants and also invasive edibles. Mallory is currently working on a book of wild food called Cucina Povera, featuring traditional world-class ethnic dishes from around the world. You can follow Mallory on Instagram at Mallory O'Donnell, and Mallory also has a website which is called How to Cook a Weed. All those links will be in the show notes. Rootbound is hosted by Steve Ellington, that is me. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, maybe you could journey out in the early spring and observe a bear from a safe distance and confirm or deny whether they actually eat bärlauch or not. That'd be cool.
I've been kissed by a rose on the gray. What does that mean? Roses.